Bad, huh? Can't. It doesn't sound like it's working. Time. Of Science and Clinical Nutrition through the New York Chiropractic College in 2000. Second. Process. Please give a warm welcome to Trovato.
Better? Okay. And all of my schooling is just officially in nutrition. I just never left the dental office. So we've just kind of slowly incorporated nutrition into what we do. And we've been coming to the IAOMT seminars for almost 20 years, but I would say over the past 10, it's been coming, like the nutrition is really integrated into what we do. Before I start, does anyone currently do nutrition counseling or decay prevention with their patients at all? A little bit? No one else? Okay. So then the hope of this talk is basically to explain how we do it and then some ideas of how you guys can kind of seamlessly integrate it into what you do, and hopefully I give you some ideas. So I think in general, when patients are finding our office or they're finding us through the IAOMT or online and they're calling and asking questions or emailing us, they're kind of looking for three main points. I think the first one is they're looking for Mercury-Safe dentistry. They're often looking for Fluoride-Free. And they're going to ask questions about our materials and looking for safe biocompatible materials. I think an important fourth one, I don't know if they always ask for this, but they do enjoy the emphasis that we put on conservative dentistry, and that gets rid of the whole don't over drill, don't injure the nerve, and kind of avoid the whole root canal situation. And basically what's more conservative than not needing the decay in the first place? So decay prevention, which is what I think a lot of patients appreciate when they come in and we're talking about this. They kind of realize that we're trying to avoid the drill as much as possible. We always say the less we need to pick up the drill, the better it's going to be. And with anything we do, our main job is going to be patient education. So no matter what the topic, it's just decay prevention in general. We'd like to kind of always put this into the patient's mind. And I think it gets reinforced throughout how we do things. And we can do it through the assistants, the doctors during the exam, the hygienists are a big part of it as well, and even the front desk when they're talking to people during checkouts or answering the phone. And so we do decay prevention remineralization. In this first part of the talk, I'm just kind of explaining how I present to patients and what we do and how we talk to them. And then you can kind of see towards the end of the presentation, I'm going to go a little bit more in depth, and I don't always share the latter part of this with the patient, mostly because I run out of time in the 20 to 30 minutes I get to talk to them. So we choose to start all of this with our new patient exam. So when people are coming in, there's no way they can kind of miss this information. It's just part of how we do things now. And we used to just give an hour for the exams. We would take the x-rays and the doctors would do the clinical part. And so now we do a full 2-hour exam. And the first hour would be still the gathering of all the general information. We're doing the pictures and scans and things like that. But within that first hour, they're going to be exposed to what makes us different as biologic dentists. We kind of allow them to answer or ask any kind of generalized questions so we can get those questions out of the way. And then we're going to provide that preventative dental education to the patient. So when the doctor comes in during the second hour, all of the general questions are kind of already out of the way, and now they can concentrate on looking at the x-rays and answering anything specifically to their case, treatment planning and things like that. It saves a lot of time for the doctor to do what they need to be able to do. This is the room that we happen to build to do this, just because we have 3 doctors and 3 doctor rooms, so we didn't have an extra room to do this initial hour, so we ended up converting a part of our front desk to this kind of little mini operatory. No drills or anything like that in there, but it's great for x-rays, pictures, the screens in front of the patient so they can see what I'm talking about. And then from here, we transfer them over to the room to finish the exam. And so I start with the x-rays because all new patients need the full mouth series when they come in, or they can transfer it over. It doesn't matter to us. But then I'll put them up on the screen to kind of show them their mouth. And this person doesn't have any work done, but I just kind of throw it up there, and then I'll say, here's the difference of what we're looking at. So now they can see the x-rays, and I want to show them the difference between full mouth series and checkup x-rays, just to kind of raise awareness of, we take this every 4 to 5 years, but they should be aware that they're going to get these checkup x-rays coming up typically at their hygiene cleaning. And so they're aware that when they just say they have the full mouth series, or they don't have the full mouth series to transfer, they only have the bite wings, I want to show them that we need to see the roots as well and have that explained to them. And from there, I kind of pick out existing dental work, nothing clinical, but I want to be able to show them that if they have a couple of crowns or a root canal, they might have 3 metal fillings, so they're at least aware of what's currently in their mouth. So when the doctor goes to talk about them, they can either ask the doctor questions about those restorations, or maybe they preemptively let me know so I can share with the doctor. But I want them to know what dental work they already have in there. And then I typically find just a tooth that has not a lot done with it so I can review anatomy with them. And I'll just kind of blow it up bigger so they can kind of see the tooth. And my lead into this with all new patients is I usually just say, I'm going to point out a few things so that way when the doctor's looking at them clinically, what he or she is doing is basically making more sense. I'm just trying to give an orientation to the patient. And when I phrase it that way, I've pretty much never gotten pushback. Everyone's kind of interested to see this kind of talk here. And I do it really simply. I just say that little black line in the center, this is going to be your nerve. Going into conservative dentistry, this is the part of the tooth that we're trying to stay away from and not injure. Around that is going to be that medium grayish area. This is the dentin, it's the part of your tooth that's alive. And then, of course, you have this protective layer that most people have heard of. It's that thinner, lighter gray area, and that would be the enamel. And that's pretty much it. And if we're going to be looking for decay, which we will when the doctor comes in, we're basically going to be seeing this progression of decay, and we're trying to see how far into the tooth it got. So then I have like a little picture I'll show you in a second that I flash up. So I say decay always starts on the outside and it works its way in. And if any time an x-ray is taken and it catches that progression of burrowing in, there's some areas that we can actually address without ever using the dental drill to see if we can kind of get on top of this. But sometimes you take an x-ray and that little tiny dark triangle looking thing in the enamel actually breaks through, and then we would consider this an actual cavity. And unfortunately, when the dentin is compromised, there's not much more you can do about it. You do want to scoop that out of there so the bacteria doesn't continue to progress and injure the nerve. And we just kind of draw that line in the sand of some things can be fully remineralized and other things do need dental intervention. And that's what the doctor's going to do, is kind of determine which one that is. The dentin is a little porous, so I kind of tell them this is the main reason why the enamel doesn't work as efficiently in the dentin, is you do need to kind of get that out so the bacteria don't spread. And this is kind of what I show them. I have a picture on the TV. Basically, I just pop this up to be able to see. It starts like a little dot, kind of forms a bigger triangle, eventually breaks through where we have the cavity. And this is definitely what we want to avoid, is this enormous cavity where the enamel or the nerve can be compromised. So we draw this line in the sand right here where the doctor is looking for these tiny little incipient areas where the decay is still all caught in the enamel and it hasn't broken down yet. And this quick little conversation takes maybe 5 minutes at most, and it basically explains them why they're getting x-rays today, the differences between a full mouth series and bite wings, kind of the importance of each. I give them that quick rundown of the anatomy of the tooth, so now when the doctor's looking at x-rays, they can semi-follow along with what they're doing. And then I explain that progression of decay, and most of them leave that little conversation kind of excited to see what the doctor now finds, to see if they do have any of these kind of starting areas where they can actually proactively do something about it, or if it did break through, now at least they can kind of rationalize and believe the doctor of like, okay, they are looking for these small things to help me, but this one did break through, and I do need to come back for that filling. Kind of gives them hope, kind of empowers them back so they can do most of this work at home, and so they don't just need to rely on coming in when something's already broken and something's already hurting, and just need the doctor to continually drill in their teeth. So from there, I always kind of just pretend. I say, pretend we found something broken down. I never point out anything clinically, but I just kind of pull up a tooth and just point to the enamel wall and say, we're going to find a little triangle here. What do we do about it if the doctor in just a little bit does find some of these areas of breakdown? We start by saying there's two main parts. Now, of course, there's more reasons why decay would happen, but if I boil it down to two main parts for the patient, it's something they can kind of take home and immediately start to address and remember in their head to be able to accomplish this. And out of the two main parts, I think most traditional dentists only really harp on the first one. They kind of continually blame home care or lack of home care as the main reason why decay is forming. And we always ask people about their home care, and some of them are very honest with us. They brush twice a week, and there's glaring issues with that, and we have to kind of correct it. But a lot of people do think that they're doing very well with home care, and the problem is it becomes very disheartening for them to try so hard, come back in a year, still end up with decay, and feel like they're just being blamed for not doing well enough. So we kind of establish what good home care is, and then tell them the good news is there's a second part of the equation. So home care is the first part. And basically, when we're establishing proper home care, we want to boil it down to the thought process of the main reason of doing it is just consistent food removal. Obviously, there's other benefits. You make the gums happy, brush the bacteria off, and things like that. But for the patient's mindset, you want to continually remove food so you're not going hours on end with food wedged between the teeth, especially at night when they're sleeping. So once step one's established at consistent food removal, mostly done through home care, we want to let them know that there's a second part, and we also need to make sure that the acid's being removed as well. And that can be done through home care at least a little bit to kind of preemptively remove a lot of the acids, but the majority of the acid removal is supposed to be handled by our saliva. That's why it's there. And so kind of the talk with the patients is not just saying do better with home care, but it's how are we going to make them make their saliva function better to get rid of the acids on a consistent enough basis. And before I tell them any of this, I just kind of double and triple stress that there's a limitation to how this works. Some of it can be remineralized when it's all stuck in that enamel, but we've had plenty of people come into our office with a giant hole in their tooth trying to remineralize it. There's a limitation of what can and cannot be done for sure. And so this is not really shared with the patient because I do concentrate on that acid removal and that acid functioning of the saliva, but there are other reasons for breakdown that you can kind of go exploring if what I'm about to say doesn't work, but I would say the majority of it works for like 90% of the patients. But real quick, you could look at someone's oral microbiome. Different bacteria in your mouth could certainly predispose you to certain things. Dental fluid flow, which is interesting to look at. It's the internal dental health. Hormones and stress levels will vary. Salivary health and flow, so dry mouth and things like that. Poor digestion and nutrient absorption, hard to get minerals in the mouth when you can't absorb them. Eating patterns and frequency, big difference between someone eating 3 meals a day and 12 meals a day. They just have more opportunity to pack food in their teeth. And then, of course, existing dental work, especially poor quality dental work, can throw kind of monkey wrenches, not just physically of not being able to floss under certain areas, but galvanism from the different metals and things like that. That'll all play a role as well. But just for the patient, for this initial talk during the exam, this is mostly what we concentrate on, is how do we get the saliva to fully function and get that pH under control. So the saliva, how does it balance acids? It's interesting because a lot of people are caring about saliva after it's not already, or after it's already gone, which is dry mouth, which is a huge issue because if you lose the saliva, you lose the bridge of that protection that you want it to give. But patients with a healthy salivary flow still need to be responsible for making sure that there's certain things inside the saliva in order for it to function. And I think this is one of the best reviews on saliva, mostly because there's not a lot of them. Most of the studies on saliva are kind of concentrating on when things go wrong. And this is just one that has nothing to do with when things go wrong. It's completely talking about what it's supposed to do, normal composition, flow, and function. So if you guys wanted to read that, it's very cool. And so for the patient, I do have this little picture of a pH scale. Most people have seen it before, but as it regards to saliva, of course, our goal is to be as close to the middle as possible. Somewhere between 6 and 7 would be considered perfectly healthy. So even in a slightly acidic range, it's fine. And it can vary all the way down to 4, maybe a little bit lower, and it can swing all the way up to 9 or maybe even a little higher. But the point we want to tell people is it goes all over the place during the day. So we can't measure them in office unless we kind of preempted them to not eat before they came in. Because if you see these little kind of pH strips or litmus papers, as soon as you put something in your mouth, it completely changes the score of that. So you can do it throughout the day for fun if you wanted to see what was going on, but patients would have to remember to do this as soon as they woke up first thing in the morning to see what the resting saliva is. And in the morning, it should be like a yellowy greenish color, somewhere between 6 and 7. If they're waking up and they're more down towards this kind of orangey yellow color, that means at some point during the night they stalled out and they weren't able to regulate that acid. Because if they could, then they would be up more towards the 6 to 7 range. So we give people little sample packets so they can buy them anywhere, CVS, Walgreens, Amazon, and we ask them to do that in the morning. And this is a very good representation of this. It's called the Steffen curve, and they're basically demonstrating that as our saliva goes up and down throughout the day, the number that we need to worry about is about 5.5. Your enamel will start to break down as you cross this threshold. Now, of course, if we go down and right back up, not much damage is done, but if people spend a really long time under that 5.5 threshold, especially at night when we're sleeping, then you start to see this continual enamel breakdown. And so this one was just done after a sucrose rinse, basically went from a healthy range of up towards 6 and 7. It dropped down to this 5.5 within 3 minutes or so. And now we spend time under this threshold, but then you kind of climb right back up. This is another study, same curve, but this is looking at a glucose rinse, which lasted a little bit longer. But it's interesting because the glucose and the sucrose, it doesn't really sit in the mouth. So basically the sugar went in, it caused this acid production, and then eventually your saliva just naturally climbs out over time. And we get back to the 5.5 and then back up to where we want to be. And the question is, how did it do that? And so all of this will function through the saliva, and I want to preempt this, assuming the food's not there. If you leave food wedged between your teeth, this is a very difficult time operating. But the saliva has a bunch of things in it besides just being water. The important ones, or at least the ones that the patient can kind of positively influence, is all the stuff over here on the left. And it's going to boil down to basically minerals and a bicarbonate system, which is baking soda. Technically, urea and ammonia do play a little bit of a buffering thing, but there's not much patients can do about that. So we want to just kind of boil it down to we need baking soda, we need minerals, and that's how your saliva was trying to function in the first place. It's just most people end up with a saliva that's deficient in these things. So for a takeaway from the patients, the minerals are going to come predominantly from the diet. The more we consume, the more we absorb. We're kind of raising the baseline of the minerals that can show up in the people's mouths. And this is where the nutrition kind of plays a role in just a second. And it's admittedly the one thing that the patient does require like a little bit of effort on their part. They can't just go home and eat TV dinners and McDonald's. The nutrient-dense foods have to come in so the minerals can get in the body. So as the saliva is being produced, there's just a higher content of minerals in it. And then home care, because everyone always asks, especially with the advent of social media, there's more and more commercials on now with basically directly rubbing minerals on the teeth. I'm sure you've seen all the hydroxyapatite things and toothpaste in there, and they all work really well. I wouldn't rub them all over my teeth, though, and assume that we never need to eat a good diet. We want them to pair together for sure. And then the baking soda, people like this even more because there's not really much you can do through the diet to raise the concentration of baking soda in your saliva. That's just going to be asked to be incorporated through home care, which pretty much everyone can do leaving the office right away without changing pretty much anything else. So this is just a quick guide of minerals. I'll come back to this later, but we give this patient to two patients as they leave. And the fun part about nutrition is with dentistry, I let the patient choose whatever diet they want to do. We're just kind of looking for the boiled down version of are we getting in enough minerals. So if people are vegetarian and they're mad that I wrote grass-fed beef, just ignore that. Don't eat meat and try something else. So no matter what the diet is, as long as it's providing some of these things, they can still kind of work with that and get these good minerals in there. I think the only thing I didn't put on there is sardines is technically really high in minerals, but people kept saying gross, so I took it off the list. So along with the foundation of consuming those mineral foods, like I said, they can be applied, and mostly this is going to be happening through toothpaste, different mouth rinses, and then specific remineralization products, which are kind of like concentrated hydroxyapatite that you more leave on like a Band-Aid rather than just brushing your teeth with it every night. But all of this plays a really nice extra credit role to this whole equation. The baking soda, we do put a pretty strong emphasis on this, just kind of teach people how to work it in through their different home cares. Because besides just physically removing the food and the plaque and the bacteria, if they can just get in baking soda to some capacity, baking soda has a pH of 9, so just instantly neutralizing those acids in the mouth almost feels like cheating. It works really well. There's a myth from the ADA that it was too abrasive. They made that up in the 70s, completely untrue. So now when we're talking to the patient, they kind of have the idea of we want to get rid of the food, we want to get rid of the acid, and we're basically doing that by increasing the minerals and increasing the baking soda. Pretty simple to follow so far, but then people always ask where that acid actually comes from. And I noticed they stopped doing it as much, but we went through about 5 to 10 years where like every TV commercial that when you turned it on, like Sensodyne was always blaming acidic drinks. It was always lemons, tea, coffee, wine, all of our teeth are melting. And we really wanted people to know that the acid is not coming from purely acidic beverages. You would never have your teeth sitting inside coffee so long to have that break down. And people were getting really worried that these types of things were the direct reason why they were getting decay, and it's just not true. And so I always like to ask the acidity from beverages, like how could you possibly keep that in your mouth long enough to see that breakdown? And when you pull a lot of the studies, I only threw up one here, but you can go look for it yourself. There's a lot of them, and they are looking at the acid erosion potential of all these different drinks, but the exposure time is always insane. It's always like 25, 48 hours, 72 hours. And sure, if you put coffee in or on your teeth for that long constantly, you'll absolutely get breakdown, but that's just not normally how people consume these beverages. And so most of the exposure times are 1, 2, 3 days or longer. It just never really made any sense. And I think it was making people worry about the wrong thing. Basically, drinks would clear from the mouth within minutes, which I always thought was another clever way that the studies would do this. And they would agree with this concept, but then kind of expand upon it. So this study I thought was cool. It said that it found that liquids cleared rapidly from the oral cavity, but then it also said it still had a significant carcinogenic and erosive potential. And I was like, okay, well, if it left the mouth so quickly, where did all this erosive potential come from? And if you go back to the same study, the beverages were no longer just coffee and tea, but they were Pepsi, Coke, fruit drinks. This says coffee, but if you read the study later, it does say, of course, they added the sugar because no one likes black coffee. I feel like they should mention that up front. And then sweetened milk. So it was just the excess sugar that was coming from the drinks that were still causing the erosion. So if we want to go back to our fun cartoon, it's not really the physical acidity of the drink, but it could technically be blamed more on the sugar contents of the drink. And of course, the normal stuff like candy and pure sugar. But I think even most patients, even if they're not looking for a biologic dentist, are aware that candy and sugar, nobody eats a candy bar and thinks that's probably okay to leave in my mouth. So it's mostly these things. It's the unassuming carbs that people would chew up and they kind of get mushy and then they get packed places in the occlusal grooves and interproximal. But people leave them there because they don't, they either don't feel that they're there and they don't know to get them out, or they just don't realize how big of a problem that they are. And I thought this was a pretty cool study as well. This was looking at foods and said foods with a higher sugar content were removed more rapidly and depressed the pH of plaque for a shorter amount of time than did foods containing far less sugar. So the starchy carbohydrates, it's really the length of time that it's spent in the mouth, not necessarily directly due to the sugar content. Length of time goes back to just the food sitting there, and for most people, when I'm talking to patients, I usually say, not that you can't get a cavity on the top of your tooth, but usually you see those occlusal cavities in children. Adults, mostly we're looking interproximal to see the flossing cavities kind of come on there, and of course along the gum line. We see a lot of gum line decay because especially when dentists kind of worry them about brushing too hard and gum erosion, then they're always worried about brushing and then they get food caught there. So just kind of telling people that you do still need to brush that food out from alongside the tooth, and those are the 3 main places that it hides in between the contact and subgingival. And we have a handout that we give to everyone, but this is a little picture that we show on their handout. People like cartoons, we just kind of say, hey, this is what we're looking at. In simplistic terms, it's not that acidity from the lemons and coffee, it's basically the food impaction. So if you start from the center, everybody eats food, food goes in our mouth, and everybody has bacteria. So of course there could be more in-depth conversations on what exactly that diet is or what type of bacteria we have, but in general, food goes in, bacteria see it, they get an opportunity to then eat the sugar because it's sitting there, and now we have this process whereas the bacteria are feeding off the sugar and the simple carbohydrates, they're producing acid as a byproduct. So again, it's not the citric acid from the lemons, it's lactic, acetic, and formic acid from the bacteria, just because food was left there too long. And once the acid is produced, we then have what we talked about a second ago of just trying to get in more baking soda, more minerals from the diet, and you get this kind of buffering capacity of the saliva. So no one's going to be so good at home care that we're always able to brush the food out so quickly that you get zero acid. Of course, removing the food lowers the overall amount of acid, but everyone should expect to have some acid go into the mouth from time to time. This is where the pH of the saliva or the ability to regulate the acids really comes into play, because you can basically just now have this cycle go around and around all on the right side, which would be great because everyone eats, we get the bacteria, get the acid, but we're able to get rid of the acid, and that acid doesn't come back until the next time we eat food, and then it gets stuck with the bacteria again. The breakdown is going to occur is when we can't keep it all on that left side of the cycle. We're going to come over here, and basically the saliva now tries to regulate the acids. It wasn't able to. The minerals in baking soda weren't enough, and it's going to start to leach the calcium and the phosphate from the enamel wall, basically dropping it into the saliva, all trying to correct this unhandled acid problem. It turns it into an odd game of tug of war, basically trying to see who can win this mineral fight, and the problem is no matter what we do dentally, you're never able to win against the saliva. The only way to win this game is to make the saliva not want to play. Get rid of the acids first. It doesn't have to pull the minerals. But if I had enough time, this is where I would kind of incorporate fluoride into my conversation. Like this is what fluoride was supposed to try to do, is create this new artificial layer of protection to slow down the acid breakdown. But most dentists give fluoride to people and then they just leave all the acids. Saliva still can't regulate it, so it slows down the breakdown maybe, but you still end up with the same amount of decay later on. It makes much more sense to correct that foundational issue of not leaving the acid there rather than rather than protecting from the acids. So we're trying to get these minerals in there so they don't have to be pulled from the teeth. And eventually, if you just let this go, more and more minerals get lost. That breaks through the enamel, it gets into the dentin, and now we have a cavity and we're back up to the top of the cycle. And I think people like that little conversation. They can kind of grasp it, makes it all make sense in their head when we're talking to patients. And this was just a kind of a cool little study here where it basically said that Stefan curve that I was talking about, basically trying to get the saliva up above 5.5 as rapidly as possible. It's more readily achieved by increasing the neutralization action of the saliva rather than just trying to continually get rid of the food, which is kind of what dentists do, brush more, floss better, things like that. But they're saying more emphasis needs to be put on the saliva, although I don't know why you would do one, not the other. Again, I'd like them to work together. And so the minerals in the baking soda, we have this kind of established for the patients to know, again, through the diet, through the home care, and baking soda through the home care. And for them, it's going to just mean they spend way less time in this acidic breakdown zone and way more time up in that neutralization zone. And that whole conversation with patients takes maybe 20, 30 minutes. And that's really if you go off on tangents and things like that. And at this point, the conversation with the patient could end and you can shunt them right over to the doctor, and they're pretty much aware of the basics. If I had a little extra time, I would harp on that frequency of eating a little bit just because these pictures are fun to show people. But this was just kind of one meal, and they extrapolated nice pictures out. Again, what if we eat 3 meals? Well, if you eat 3 meals and then do a good job getting that food out right afterwards, you should only be shunted down a little bit, and you go right back up and lunch, and then here's dinner. And again, you just spend way more time above that pH of 5.5. But then when people have that snacking ability all throughout the day, breakfast snack, lunch snack, et cetera, again, it's just more opportunity for that acid to depress below that 5.5 range. And I think what they don't point out on here, this is only assuming that every single time you eat something, you also did a good job to remove that food. If you're not really brushing or flossing or rinsing or just something to debride that food out in between meals, then certainly you're going to spend way more time down there. So it's not really telling people they can't graze throughout the day. It's just saying that if they do graze throughout the day, they have to put a little bit more of an emphasis on food removal throughout the day, which could end up being a little neurotic, but still you just can't walk around for hours with food in there. And this was just a fun cartoon kind of showing the smooth ride of the stiffened curve or just throwing the tooth for a loop there because there's so much acid going in. And after we provide all this information to the patient, I usually like to ask them questions on their home care, basically just to gauge what they're doing so I can let the doctor know before they go in. And like I said earlier, people are usually pretty honest. They'll tell us. And from what they tell us, I usually kind of say, we're trying to establish a bare minimum. So if they're doing really well, we can praise what they're already doing. But if they're missing some concepts, then we can quickly throw in what they should kind of immediately switch. And so I asked them how they're brushing every day, morning and night, just one of them. Are they flossing once a day, once a week, et cetera. And I want to establish their bare minimum with that patient so they know that we're not just telling them to floss more. There's a reason behind it. So bare minimum, they could just establish that the most important time to brush and floss is going to be at night because you don't want to go hours sleeping with that food sitting in there. Plenty of people are only brushing in the morning, mostly because they're just not aware. They brush in the morning for fresh breath and they don't do it at night. I'd rather them switch that around, but of course, the more the better. And then we incorporate baking soda. So if immediately we can now have people start brushing at night when they weren't before and now utilizing the baking soda, tremendous leaps forward from what they were doing a second ago. And then throughout the day, I always joke with people, like I do carry floss in my jacket pocket in my car. I'm just constantly getting food out of there, but I'm aware that no one's ever going to do that mostly. So I just tell people to drink more water, rinse after meals, have lunch, grab a glass of water, swish your mouth out. It does more than they would think. And most people, I would say, agree to do that. And we see very nice benefits from that alone. So we'll teach them about flossing. If they hate this floss, we could do floss on a stick, or maybe they water floss. Doesn't matter to us. The whole concept is getting food out from between the teeth. And this is a fun little technique that we started teaching people, pretty much everybody, but mostly when people say they hate flossing. If I just said they should floss more, that conversation never really helps anyone. So this is at least an alternative. If people are very honest and saying they're never going to floss, this is now 1,000% more effective than doing nothing. But we use these little nylon toothpicks. There's other brands that make it, but gum is a good one. They're everywhere. And we have people mix up a little slurry of baking soda. If they just have water, you can just mix it with water, but hydrogen peroxide was part of this initial Kai's technique back in the 70s. And they were using a mixture of baking soda and peroxide to clean between the teeth. He was having people brush with it. We just kind of adapted it to this flossing technique. This I just made for patients because some people are really neurotic and they wanted the exact breakdown. Basically, you just throw some powder and then some water and you mix it around till it's a slurry. If you put too much powder in, add more water. But this does break down to a nice ratio. I've also had people ask if they could just throw the baking soda in their mouth without mixing it outside of the mouth. It does work. And this is kind of what it looks like. So you make this little slurry in here, you scoop it up, it sits on these bristles, and now when you take that and you're working it between the teeth, you're not only potentially pushing the food out the back and dislodging it, but you're actually getting that pH of 9 kind of right between the area, which is basically where most of that interproximal breakdown would occur. And I kind of tell people do like 2 or 3 teeth, rinse it off in the sink, dip it again, 2 or 3 teeth. Once they get good at it, the whole thing takes like 60 seconds. It's very quick to do. It's not adding that much effort. And I would do this at night. You can take a picture of this as you want to. It's just written things of what I said out loud, kind of step by step of how they would do this. After the soft pick technique or the floss, if they are good flossers, we kind of talk about the brushing. I let the hygienist and the doctor go over like the physical showing of how they should brush and make sure they're getting all the nooks and crannies and things like that. But everyone without fail wants to know what the best toothpaste is. And they always come in with a bag and here's my toothpaste. Is it better than the ones you sell here? No, basically we're looking for good quality, get rid of a lot of the chemicals. We're looking to have not have fluoride in there. So we sell a couple in office, but the main ones that we picked already had the baking soda in it, and that's mainly why we did it. So if people are coming in, they're like, well, what about Risewell? What about Earth Paste? They're great, love those products. I would just tell them to sprinkle the baking soda right on top to kind of add that one extra ingredient, and then you can pretty much use any product you want. A couple of these already have it in it. Common Sense has it in it already, or Restore has it in it. Wellness has it in it already. I think Dr. Bronner's does as well, but it's a little bit lower on the ingredients list, so it can never hurt to add just a little bit more. And then tongue scrape, rinsing, we'll kind of go over that. We kind of do a little talk on how we don't use Listerine and Scope, but there's better ways to do that. I'd rather than just rinse with baking soda and salt, but there's a lot of good products out there that are making better quality rinses if people really wanted to do that. The remineralization products, so people could use this generally if they wanted to, but it's mostly to be kind of thought of after the doctor does his exam. If they're looking and they're finding no cavities, but there are some of those starting breakdowns that we need to get on top of, the patient should still follow through with everything I just mentioned, but you can kind of get a little extra help by rubbing these things directly on your teeth to get a concentrated form of calcium and phosphate, kind of like a Band-Aid right to that area that was breaking down. The big one in dentistry, people use MI paste all the time. Some patients complain about it because there is an artificial sweetener in there, so we just tell them to read the ingredients and make their own choice. Oral wellness is the other one we carry in our office, but people will ask about Dr. Michelle's, and there's a bunch of, there's so many, they're all basically the same thing. They're all made very well, and it's a little Band-Aid approach, so we just raise awareness about that as well. This is the handout on home care that we give directly to the patients. So kind of all those slides I just went through. I'm not doing a slide presentation for all of our patients. I'm handing them this handout. And it goes through the floss, the soft pick technique, the brush, the tongue scraping. It talks a little bit about oil pulling and mouthwash and those different toothpaste up here. So now they get to go home. And even if they're not going to remember everything I just said, they're able to kind of now go home and read and digest this and hopefully implement it. And there's also a handout on pH. So again, my whole lecture is boiled down to 2 pages on this handout here that we give to the patient, kind of how they measure the acidity, why that matters, using the baking soda and the minerals. Here's that fun little circle I'll point out to them as they're sitting in front of me. Here's the little breakdown thing so they can follow a long paragraph about the remineralization products. And some long-term goals that we boil down. So just, again, patient information as much as possible. And at the very bottom, this is kind of how we handle nutrition. I just give them a list. Blew it up for you. And it goes back to that mineral list I mentioned earlier, but we would say everything over here would just be foods dense in minerals. Doesn't matter to us if you eat everything on that list or just include a lot of some of them. You're just trying to work them in as much as possible so you can get better mineral density in your saliva. And all of the ones on the left side over here gives you those minerals, but basically does not really feed the bacteria at all. Oral bacteria don't really feed off of proteins, fats, and vegetables. So it doesn't really mean that it's the only thing you're allowed to eat. It's just raising awareness that there's kind of a division between proteins and fats and carbohydrates, because that's what the oral bacteria are looking for. And they can read that on their own and agree or disagree. So providing that quick list of mineral-dense foods to the patients, oftentimes that's enough, and I can just hand it to them, and now they can kind of tell me what they're eating. A lot of people like to share with me what they're already doing. But if I had some time, I can go a little bit more in depth with them, especially if they want to ask questions and go off on tangents. And so the first thing we normally do if we were kind of establishing a good diet, again, is just that reduction of sugar and carbohydrates, along with just getting them out from between the teeth. And so most people will read that list that was on the lower side there, and they automatically say like, oh, I don't eat any of these. I got rid of all processed foods in my diet, which is awesome. And then they'll go through a list of things they do eat, and they'll still talk about things like sweet potatoes and fruits and quinoa and all those things, which is much better of a dietary choice, but you still can't just leave them packed between the teeth. So this is not really trying to vilify all carbohydrates. Obviously, if we're just talking about health and nutrition, some are healthier than others. But for oral health, even if we're doing these obvious examples, like I'd rather eat a sweet potato than a bag of chips or an apple versus white bread, we're just trying to raise awareness to the patient that oral bacteria don't really have eyeballs. They can't tell it's an apple or a Wonder Bread. They're just going to eat them as if it's all the same. And a lot of people didn't know that. They were just like, I had no idea. I eat these things all the time. I barely brush my teeth. I thought I was doing okay. So it's just that repetitive message to them that it's the food clearance of these carbohydrates, because even if left in the mouth, all carbohydrates eventually break down into sugar. And it's just creating that little bit of a neurotic feedback loop for the patient to just have a meal, rinse their mouth out, get that food out of there. And I think most of them can concur with that. So once the diet's cleaned up of foods to avoid, we can kind of shift over what to include. And again, we're just looking for that mineral density, because the more minerals you can get in, the better pH buffering potential that your saliva has. And potentially that remineralization of the enamel. You're adding the calcium and phosphate back. So back to that same list from before, those minerals, these were all the things that we're trying to get in as much as possible in order to increase the mineral density. And once we establish the minerals, there are other beneficial nutrients that you can do, mostly fat-soluble vitamins, A, D, E, and K. A lot of this was Weston Price stuff talking about the D and the K, although we called it Activator X back then, but showing that it was just an increased help of mineral metabolism, assimilation, and utilization in the body. And he didn't use supplements technically, but these are some vitamin D and vitamin K supplements that people can take. And it doesn't matter the brand, just these are the two we carry here, not here in the office. But if they wanted to do it more through a whole food source, this is what he was doing in his book. He was basically using butter and cod liver oil for the majority of his patients. And people will ask, like, do I have to? I read Rustin Price's stuff, and should I be using cod liver oil? You could, absolutely. Just the reason why it worked, it was very high in D and K, and he was getting those nutrients in. He just didn't have those supplements in 1920. And today we need to stress a little bit more on quality. Butter in 1920 is not the same butter as we have today, so getting the good quality grass-fed butter would be ideal to make sure the nutrient contents are there. You could also do it through foods, and so these are some of the better fat-soluble foods that people could include. Eggs, cream, cheese, butter from pasture-raised animals, grass-fed meats, organs, wild-caught fish, avocados, nuts, olive, bone broth, sardines again, but very, very good for that. And fermented foods, another one where most people say is gross and they'll never do it, but technically it is very, very high in vitamin K2. 1 spoonful a day is enough to completely negate any kind of additional supplementation, which is fun. And it doesn't matter what it is, just the fermentation process is what produces the K2. So you can ferment almost anything these days, so that's another beneficial thing to include. Smoothies was interesting. We were telling people to do smoothies sometimes because people hate vegetables. We were trying to be creative of how we can get in more minerals, so we told them to do smoothies because if they hated the vegetables, maybe they can blend it up and make it taste like chocolate peanut butter and still be okay. But we did it for a while without realizing that not everyone knew how to make smoothies, and people were just blending like spinach and water together and telling me it was gross. So we built an entire webpage on just how we can pack in mineral-dense smoothies, of kind of concentrating on the vegetables that get in there. So we just defer people to read that on our website. It's very good. There are supplements. We don't push a lot of supplements in our practice, but we have them just in case people wanted to. But if I had to boil down a list of supplements that would be directly beneficial for enamel remineralization, liquid trace mineral drops a lot of people are doing, so I think that's really good just to get kind of a blanket in there. The fat-soluble vitamins A, D, and K, vitamin C, and magnesium do play a role in that enamel remineralization as well. B vitamins mostly for salivary health, and then collagen is just good for tooth structure in general. The dentin is made very highly out of collagen. And so kind of boiling this all down, again, I'm well done past talking to the patient at this point, but kind of reinforcing what all of this talk is doing for the patient. We're trying to show them that the decay is completely preventable. It's just not this inevitable thing that people are just going to get cavities as they go throughout their lifetime. Decay is reversible if caught early enough, again, stressing that it has to still be that breakdown of the enamel for all this to work beautifully. Home care is essential to consistently remove food from the mouth, so you're not continually dumping more and more acid as the bacteria have access to that food. If I was going to pick once to do it, I would brush my teeth and floss my teeth at night to get that food out of there before we go to bed. Anything done throughout the day, it's all extra credit. Even something as simple as drinking water, you can swish that food debris out of there so it's not sitting there. And while there's tons of contributing factors to decay, I would start with the acid balance being the foundation for the patients to grasp, because just that key aspect of the baking soda and minerals and making the saliva function better, pretty much everyone can grab that and kind of go from there. Saliva function is one of the most critical factors in controlling acids. Of course, we still do want to get rid of the food, but the saliva function is very important. It does its job by using baking soda and minerals to buffer the acids. We can increase the salivary minerals through diet and home care. We can increase vitamin D and vitamin K to help absorb the minerals and assimilate the minerals into the teeth. Also helps with like old extraction sites and things like that. Would be very good. Increasing baking soda by physically incorporating it in the home care. And then you could talk about the frequency at which they eat. Basically decreasing the frequency just helps remove the food easier. This is how we charge for it. So originally we had just our normal clinical exam. The numbers are obviously going to change based off of where you are. And we just had one fee for the comprehensive exam. We charged for the x-rays, and then all these other things that we were doing, the more and more we got in the biologic dentistry, we had like a small fee attached to each one. And it got a little weird with patients kind of like seeing their printout and nitpicking the prices and things like that. So over the years, we basically just zeroed them all out and lumped it into one other charge. So the total for our exam is $240. The x-rays are extra, but we usually just tell people 120 of that 240 exam is usually not covered by insurance. Just set that expectation that they're going to be responsible for 120 out of pocket. And we chose to use the code D1310, which if you look it up, the actual term for it is Nutrition Counseling for Control and Prevention of Oral Disease, which is basically what we're doing. But then we were getting pushback that everyone was saying, well, I didn't want the nutrition counseling, so I just changed it. We now call it Biologic Dental Education and Diagnostics. It's the part of our office that incorporates nutrition. It makes us biologic. We don't separate it from the rest of our office or our exam. And so again, our main goal is patient education. So it's not just the new patient exam that's going to be reinforcing this message, but we have the assistants talk about it, the doctors reinforce it during the exam, the hygienists certainly talk about it when they come back for their recall appointments. We have information on our website. We post about it on social media. I showed you 2 handouts, but we actually have 36 total, so we have a ton of handouts that we give patients. I made office pictures that we hung in all the operatories and on the walls, so as people are just walking by, they see the same message over and over again. We have a TV slideshow that goes all the time, and we've changed out all of our reading material in the waiting room. I already showed you the 2 handouts that we give to every new patient. This is the 2 main ones that come with the new patient exam. But as they go through the new patient exam and they need certain things, we have handouts on root canals, on mercury, on implants, so they're just kind of leaving with a packet of everything that directly applies to their mouth. This is a fun little picture that I photoshopped. I blew it up and made it on Vistaprint. If you guys know that website, I printed it out and framed it. So now it's in all of our hygiene operatories, and it's in our waiting room, and I think there's one in the hallway. Just to kind of show everything I did, I tried to boil it down in these little points. Unless you read this little paragraph, everyone asks why I'm promoting fluoride. It's just telling people how fluoride was supposed to work and why I have better options to do it. Maybe I should have rephrased that, but it's not promoting fluoride. That's the little TV we have in our waiting room that's just constantly playing a little slideshow, so as people are sitting in their chairs, they're directly facing that, and they have no choice but to watch it. We got rid of most of the magazines in our waiting room, and we replaced it with this bookshelf, and I just loaded it with all these different books that we've read over the years. Sometimes people steal them, but we try to keep an eye on that. And then this is the one room that we do the new patient exams in. This is all the kind of enamel remineralization books that I've read over the years. It's what I use to write my dissertation, but it's conversation starters. People will sit down, they'll look up there, and they'll kind of watch, oh, I've read that book, and it's just kind of fun to always have this on display. We actually created an online program, so if people wanted to learn more after their new patient exam, they can kind of go online. They'd be looking for this reversing the decay process, because it goes through everything I just said about the foundation of that acid, but if they had other issues like dental flow or bacterial problems, this is where we have the opportunity to share that with them, just because we don't have enough time in the office to go through each individual thing. This is something we made for local practitioners when we speak to them. And so I think overall, when we're kind of unifying this message throughout our office, it basically is giving the power back to the patient. So they're now taking a more proactive approach in decay prevention. So they're not just kind of feeling that dentists are out to get them or out to find all these cavities. The dentists are actually looking at these x-rays so they can find the cavities if needed. But hopefully we find nothing at all. But if we do find something, I hope it's in that incipient enamel section so they can actually go home and rebuild that. Builds trust with the dentist, because now if the dentist does come in for the second part of the exam and they find a cavity, they just spend an hour talking to me, kind of explaining how we don't want to actually find this decay. So it kind of helps build that trust of when we do find something, it actually is a problem. Adds value to the practice. I think a lot of people think this is a very unique thing to find in dentistry, so it adds that kind of uniqueness. But technically you could find ways to charge for it as well. But it helps the patient live a cavity-free life. And so those are all my studies. They'll flash through. Not my studies, but the studies I use to do a lot of this research and the dissertation and things like that. But I assume it's on the slide through the IAOMT. If you guys wanted to read all that, I just didn't have time to put it in a slide to stay on time. And that should get to the bottom. And then here's my thank you slide. So, good? Yeah. If anyone had any questions, I mean, obviously the Speakum Forum, but I was going to say, if you wanted to write down my email and email me directly, it's what I do all day long, is just email people back, so that's fun.
Let's give Anthony one more round of applause. Thank you. I'm going to give you the AGD completion code. I'll repeat it 3 times. IP as in corporate prevention, 32224, AT as in Anthony Trovato,
IP 3224AT.